Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today at Sophocles and Tuirida. And I've been asked to talk to you today about the EUCROF New Technologies Working Group, where I'm the chairman and Ioannis Matsakis is the deputy chairman. We are a team within EUCROF who like to look at how new technologies are going to impact on the way we run clinical trials. At present, we have 3 sub-teams that are each working on different areas. One of them is the Code of Conduct team, which is looking at a Code of Conduct for GDPR. I'll get into that more in a minute. We have an EConsent team that is looking at how can we best implement EConsent in our trials, and an archiving team, which looks at how do we archive the results afterwards. Besides these 3 teams, we're also participating in a series of artificial intelligence workshops with the EMA and the FDA. Okay, so to get to the first one, the Code of Conduct for Data Protection in Clinical Trials, where Ioannis is the team leader. And the final draft, as of the 2nd of December, 2 weeks ago, has been released. We've got a master document, and we've shared it with the lead data protection authority. So we've come quite a bit of the ways in defining a code of conduct. And the EUCROF code is made up of a set of documents. And the set can be used in its entirety. So if you decide that you're going to adopt the EUCROF code of conduct, you have to adopt all of these documents. I won't go into too much detail about each of them. We've got a limited amount of time, and I want to talk about the other teams as well. But this is a very interesting initiative where the idea is that you can produce a code of conduct for following GDPR as a data privacy regulation in the EU, and not necessarily have to employ your own data privacy officer or to write your own code of conduct. So it's aimed at smaller to medium-sized enterprises. A lot of smaller to medium-sized CROs are members of EUCROF, which is where the idea started originally, but it's not actually limited just to CROs. So any small or medium-sized enterprise working in the EU or who wants to work in the EU with clinical trials can join the EUCROF Code of Conduct. And it starts with a service contract and a data processing agreement, which addresses data protection matters. So you have to have a contractual relationship between the different parties that are a part of your trial. The code establishes a set of requirements. There's a master document with 92 requirements for data privacy. There's an ISO 27001 requirements, which are 113 looking at information security. And then we have the HTH 40 requirements. So a total of 245 requirements that you have to look at and adopt within your company. And this provides guidance on compliance methods for each requirement. We're not just listing the requirements. And we specify a series of classes of scope. So not every company is providing the same services. And so you can sort of look at more detail, which services are being provided by your company, and what does that mean in terms of the requirements. And so a CRO or another small or medium-sized enterprise adheres to the code when it can demonstrate compliance with all the requirements that are applicable to the services that they deliver. So they have the requirements and they have the services being delivered and the mapping between them. So in a document 4, you will have the mapping, for example, a class of service, SME, yes, and so on. So you will define the services with requirements to get your compliance scheme. And then you'll update your information and security management system. Some key features. Compliance with this scheme will make it mandatory to establish an ISMS, an information security management system. And this can be seen as a complement of the QMS. What we've actually done in my company, we've combined them. So we don't have a separate ISMS and a QMS. We have one quality management system, or one management system, as we're starting to call it, which includes the typical QMSs that we all have in the clinical research industry, with just a few additions that were needed for information security. And I'm talking about a very small number of editions. We already had almost all of the documents required by 27001, ISO 27001. So it's not a great deal of additional work for people who are working in clinical trial industry as we are. You have to have a data processing agreement as a mandatory when you're in a processor-sub-processor relationship, which of course is, you would expect that with GDPR. And then they have a couple of special occasions here that if you're providing IT services, and I think a lot of us are, then they are now going to require that you be ISO 27001 certified. I think not as many companies as I thought are ISO 27001 certified. I know that we're in the process of being it now. We should be it early in the next year. But when we looked at some of our other key competitors, just to compare and see, are we behind the rest of the market, we found out that not many of them were actually certified, which surprised me. I thought we were behind the rest of the field, and I think a lot of companies have been looking at it the same way we have, that they've been judging that ISO 27001 is not necessary because we're working with GCP, and you can't be certified for GCP. But as IT services become more and more important, it's becoming a shortcut for regulatory compliance. If you can say you're ISO 27001 certified, then people stop asking questions in that field. So I think it's a good thing. Adherence to the code should have the same effect as the standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules, so that you have to ensure that all of your vendors, all other parties involved in international transfers are adhering to the code as well. The next steps, we're getting very close. We're going to deliver the final draft in English and French. We're going to have a formal, it's going to be introduced into the formal approval process by all EU member states, by their data protection authorities, and it's going to be followed up. We've been interfacing directly with CNIL in France, and they've approved it for moving forward with all the other EU member states. We're promoting the code, as I mentioned earlier, not only internally to CROs, but even externally. And we've had webinars for all EUCROF affiliates and all other stakeholders. We've talked to external reviewers such as FBA and ACRO about reviewing the code. And we're going to encourage the usage of EUCROF code documents from now on. And we're also setting up an independent governance body. This is not something that EUCROF themselves will be judging. Are you compliant or are you not compliant? There'll be an independent governance body that will certify companies who want to say that they're compliant with the code of conduct. And we're going to have other stakeholders on the board. So it's not going to only be EUCROF running the show. And then, of course, EUCROF has their own CRO IT platform, and they're going to have to adapt that to the code of conduct as well. Okay, so that was the code of conduct team, which is an exciting initiative. Another very exciting initiative is the EConsent team. And the team leaders there are Fiona Maney and Mika Lindros. The EUCROF eConsent team, it's a joint initiative between EUCROF and the eClinical Forum. And the team is composed then of CROs who come mainly from EUCROF and of sponsors and vendors who are mainly members of the eClinical Forum. But this way we managed to get a very good team composition put together. They've also interviewed and engaged with other stakeholders, including the regulatory authorities. They've had discussions with both the EMA and the MHRA. Okay, the activities they're going through now is they're looking at the key deliverables and how to get access to small and medium-sized enterprises. They want to provide insight and knowledge around eConsent. And they've already started that. They've had 2 webinars this year, one in June and one in November, which were very well attended EUCROF webinars, over 100 participants in each. The latest webinar, which is the 30th of November, was planned to run for an hour and a half, but it kept going for 2 hours. They had a 1-hour presentation, and then they were thinking of having a half-an-hour panel session, and that turned into a 1-hour panel session. They're producing for release next year an eConsent practical implementation guideline, and we think this is one of the key deliverables from the team, is this is for anyone who wants to introduce eConsent into their clinical trials. Some practical steps and things that you should think about when you're doing it. They're also engaging with the wider industry and trying to promote the use of eConsent in Europe. As we know, Europe is a little bit behind the US when it comes to adopting eConsent, and there's still a certain amount of skepticism with local authorities in Europe. And they want to provide a sounding board and a forum for discussion from other groups as well. So this is a very complicated diagram, which I'm not going to get into too much detail about. But basically, the larger diagram at the top here is meant to be a representation of the entire clinical trial process from start, when you start thinking about a trial, until you're finished. And this is just showing where the eConsent implementation process fits into that trial process. Before you start the actual trial, which is this big wide one here, you have to do the eConsent implementation. And this is an example of what the eConsent implementation guide. It's going to be practical considerations to be used by anyone who's considering adopting eConsent in their trials. Okay, now we move on to the next area, the archiving and decommissioning position paper. This is the team that I'm the team leader of, so I know a bit about it. This is also a joint EUCROF and eClinical Forum team. And this was actually formed after discussions with the EMA GCP's Inspectors Working Group at workshops they had about 2.5 years ago in London. And then they invited us to another workshop 1.5 years ago in Bonn. And we've had some very good discussions with them. And our scope is to present a view from industry on archiving of electronic essential documents and data and computerized systems. So there are 2 members of EUCROF, 14 from the eClinical Forum, and then we have a number of other members representing other organizations such as ePro Consortium, RQA, ECRIN, and Medicines for Europe. Okay, we've got a lot of positions. Now, these are going to turn up in a funny order because I've reordered the positions, but I forgot to reorder the automation. So we'll see what happens. But rather than that, I won't go into each position in detail. I'll just mention that we have our 2 major areas are work with a decentralized trial master file. So we want to be able to say that the sponsor doesn't have to keep all of the documents for every trial, because there are a lot of documents that are no longer trial specific. So here we talk about different aspects of the trial master file. It's still the sponsor's responsibility to ensure that there are contracts in place, but they don't actually have to collect all the documents themselves. And that means that there does have to be a periodic check of archives out with their vendors to ensure that they're still there and can still be read. Sites may decide to use trusted third parties to archive some of their documents instead of doing it all themselves. This is not really that new because they already do that with Iron Mountain, but that's with regard to paper documents. All we're saying really is that they can do the same thing with electronic documents. And the sponsor has to define and implement an index of all of the essential documents in their trial. And this index includes signposts pointing to where to find the different documents. Okay, and we have the other main area of position is around electronic systems. And I think one of the key ones that we're discussing, which is of interest to everyone who works with electronic systems in clinical trials, we've seen comments from the regulatory authorities on both sides of the Atlantic, in that they would like to see data kept, for example, in EDC systems for some considerable time to allow inspectors to go to the EDC systems and examine the data in situ, as it were. We don't think that this is an effective way of running a trial. So our position is that you do not have to keep any electronic trial systems in a live transactional state when they're not being used in the trial anymore. So, and what we mean is our idea is that we think that this seems to be a solution from the regulators for the fact that there are some pieces of data they're not seeing in the archives. And we think the better solution is to make sure that the archives are complete instead of requiring systems to be available for a long period of time. And that's the next position, of course, that all essential documents have to be migrated into appropriate archive formats. And you can't just take PDFs from the data entry. You have to make sure you have all the other pieces of data that are necessary to recreate the trial. All the audit trails, all the query history, all the information on the users and the roles they had, etc. We've also stated that with something that we've talked about a lot at the conference so far today, wearables and ancillary devices. Some people seem to think that we have to keep all the data generated by one of these devices and archive that. And it's massive amounts of data, as I'm sure you're aware. We're talking easily terabytes. Our position is that we hope to get accepted by the authorities. It's only the aggregated data that you're collecting from your medical device that you need to archive. So if you've got a step counter, you only have to archive the number of steps. You don't have to archive all of the metadata that goes into calculating whether or not a step has been taken. And that, I think, is a fairly simple thing that will simplify immediately the archiving requirements for these wearables. Oh, sorry, that one disappeared. No, going the wrong way. There. And then finally, we've introduced the idea that there are going to be archivists and archivist duties, rather, within all organizations. If you're going to be storing a decentralized TMF with all the different parties who are part of a trial, there's going to have to be people in those organizations who are responsible for ensuring that those archives remain viable and that they remain accessible. Okay, the next steps. We've actually come quite a fair bit of a way. We've got a draft version of a position paper that lists each position with approximately 1 page of justification for each of them. And it's out on a second review round now, which includes both the EMA and the FDA have agreed to provide informal comments, and a number of major organizations, as well, of course, as all the internal members at EUCROF and at the eClinical Forum. And we've asked everyone to return their comments by the 15th of January. And we're hoping that we'll be able to compile and release a final document fairly shortly after that. We'll see how many comments we get, of course. We're also starting to prepare a slide deck so we can go out to conferences and webinars next year and present the entire positions as they are. And we're also going to produce more detailed white papers or technical papers on the individual positions or groups of them to go into even more detail and explain. For example, I anticipate that one of those papers will talk about why we don't need to keep electronic systems online longer than we're using them in the trial. Okay, those were the 3 teams. They're all coming to a head really this year or early next year. So we anticipate that we'll be starting new teams next year to look at new areas of interest, new areas of new technology. And one of them is artificial intelligence, which we think is very interesting and which has been talked a bit about today as well. So there's been a workshop which was organized by the FDA together with the EMA, and the SCDM were a part of that. At a conference in Baltimore, they got talking and decided to have a workshop to discuss how do we validate AI in clinical research. And then the EMA decided to reach out to some European partners that they work with. We've worked with, as I say, with the archiving paper, we worked quite closely with the EMA. And so they contacted us and said that they would like us to help organize this AI workshop. So that's what we did. And we had a workshop on the 22nd of September this year. So we've already had the workshop. And it was quite interesting. And it got a lot of very good comments from the regulators. They were pleased with the workshop, and they decided already to have a sequel. And that will probably be in June, although the date hasn't been set. They have set up a new program committee to set the program, and work has already started. They're also going to produce a technical paper describing the last workshop, the one on September the 22nd. And so they're going to try to get that published in a journal somewhere, just describing what was said and what was presented to sort of whet people's interest for the future. And then hopefully they'll be looking at a face-to-face workshop when people can meet face-to-face again, which probably won't be until the second half of next year at the earliest, if then. So, while I've mentioned a lot of this, producing a summary document, next meeting, we've already had the meeting on December 15th, which was 2 days ago, and the new virtual workshop, face-to-face workshop. And I'm on that planning committee as a representative of EUCROF. We have other members as well. So, and I forgot to mention, I meant to mention at the very beginning that, of course, one of the members of the new technology working group is Sophocles. And so he's a very valued member. I didn't actually list all the members of the group, but Sophocles is one of our valued members. Thank you.